So social psychology is sort of founded around this idea of human interaction, right? The whole, if all of your friends jumped off of a bridge, would you? You know, kind of dumb parent question that people like to ask. But to get into the topic, let's look at social psychology as a field. Social psychology is very similar to sociology. In fact, it is a social psychologist is someone who's going to study social interactions or the dynamics of groups, and how that specifically affects the mind and the behavior and the attitudes of people. So when we get into things like intellectual differences between different socioeconomic groups, prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, those are social categories. Race is a social category. Culture is a social category. Ethnicity, things like that. Roles, expectations, norms, those are all social categories as well. So you think about some of the more prominent social psychologists. The one that jumps to mind to me is Erik Erikson. And let's review Erikson for just a second. When you look back in chapter 10 and you look at Erik Erikson, he's a guy that really fell into a lot of categories, so to speak. He was adopted. He lived in sort of a straight-laced Scandinavian family. He was half Jewish ethnically, like half Hebrew. And he just really didn't feel like he had an identity in one particular, you know, let's call it a group, right? So that's the problem with party politics, or party identification, we'll say. So Erikson was very much interested in role identification from a young age. So when he became older, he started studying human behavior, studied psychology, became a psychologist, and he started studying social interactions among people. Erikson's major theory is based around social tasks, right? So if you look at all the developmental theorists, you have Freud, and of course his stages are psychosexual, and he has 5 of them. You have Piaget, and his stages are cognitive, and he has 4 of them. And then you have Erikson. Erikson has 8 stages. But Erikson is unique because his are not about cognitive tasks or psychosexual development. His are about the development of the person as you achieve a social task, right? So some of the examples would be when you're a young kid, according to Erikson, like little kids are going to struggle with autonomy. Being autonomous is being able to do things on their own, right? Little kids are, no, mom, let me do it. I can do it on my own. And so for Erikson, every task had sort of it's called a consequence, right? So if little kids didn't experience autonomy, then they faced guilt, shame, and doubt, right? So everything is kind of like a social cognitive task or a repercussion, we'll say. And then you get into, you know, this competence level, and you get into, you know, young adolescents from 13 to say 18, and Erikson believed that it was a struggle for finding one's identity, right? So I like using Erikson in the identity stage to start talking about interpersonal relationships. So according to Erikson, the social goal of adolescence is to establish one's identity, right? And that matters because what he considered to be the consequence of a lack of identity is role confusion, right? And role is a social expectation. This is, whether or not it's problematic is a totally different discussion. But Erikson believed that teenagers were trying to find their self. They were trying on different things, right? Figuratively, maybe literally, I don't know, trying on different clothes, hairstyles, musical, you know, styles, friend groups, whatever niche category you could experiment with. You're, you know, exploring your sexuality as a teenager. You're exploring, you know, I don't know, your likes and dislikes, your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, your ethics and your morals, right? This is the goal of the teenager. So I'm going to use that as kind of the context into relationships, and there's an interesting reason why. I think, in Erikson's standpoint, once you develop your sense of identity as an adolescent, then the next step is to find intimacy, right? So it's not going to be on the screen, but one of your modules in this chapter deals with interpersonal relationships, right? About the romantic nature and of a platonic nature, we'll say. So there's 2 vocab words that we're going to start off with, and again, they're not on your screen, but it's worth noting that the 2 terms that are referred to in the textbook are passionate love and companionate love. right? So describing being a companion. So I'm going to use some synonyms just for the sake of discussion. Let's say that, especially in a romantic relationship, let's say that you have two variables present, two components to a functional romantic relationship. You have attraction and you have intimacy, right? So let's look at those two things. And obviously that's making it a little bit too broad and downplaying it, but just track with me on this. So let's say that a successful romantic relationship consists of attraction and intimacy, companionship, right? So, and I would pose to you that it really doesn't matter which comes first, right? So what usually typically starts out as attraction can develop into intimacy, right? We're good. But I would also argue to you that what starts out as intimacy can develop into attraction, right? So there's a third vocab word, not just passionate and companionate love, that we're going to explore here, and that's the term the mere exposure effect. Mere as in M-E-R-E, as in like just by merely being exposed to someone. It is insignificant level of exposure, we'll say. So the mere exposure effect is this social, psychological just idea that when you bond with people over time and you get to know them interpersonally, obviously your guard is let down and you start to build this bond of intimacy that we know as oxytocin, right? But that can turn into romantic attraction pretty often, right? So that's the mere exposure effect. This is the idea that people that you have a companionate relationship with, say the intimacy side of things first, can develop into attraction. And so a romantic relationship, or at least a romantic attraction, even if it's not reciprocated, a romantic attraction can develop from companionship, right? So that's kind of your, out of the 47 vocab terms in question here, the three that we're going to focus on in relationships are companionate love, intimacy, passionate love, which is like attraction, right? And the mere exposure effect, so how one can lead to the other. Now, when you look at the definitions of companionate love versus passionate love, they're very similar. They're very similar. So I'm going to explain them to you in a way that I want you to understand the difference, because the words are actually easier to distinguish than the vocab terms. So don't focus on the jargon. Focus on what it is that we're trying to establish here. Passion, I like the Greek explanation here, right? So when we talked back in chapter 7 about linguistic determinism, this guy, Benjamin Whorf, had this theory that people can really only comprehend what they have language for, right? So like language, a lot of theorists have suggested that we interact with the world, and this is Piaget, by creating language. So if we don't have vocabulary for something, it doesn't exist as a concept in our mind, right? And there's tribes like the Hopi tribe that have no past tense, so they don't actually have a way to contemplate past experiences because they don't even have language for that, right? So if we take the linguistic determinism theory and sort of apply that to love and romance, let's look at the Greek language compared to, say, the English language, right? So in the Greek language, they don't have a blanket term that we use as love, right? So in the English language in the Western world, we say love. We mean a whole manner of different things. In the Greek language, they have separate terms for the emotions behind a loving relationship, but they also have separate terms for the relationship itself, right? So in the 7 different words that the Greek language uses to describe love, you have things like adelphoi, and adelphoi is this Greek concept of like brotherly love, right, where the name Philadelphia comes from, right? It's this idea of companionship at a level that's so deep that it's almost like family, right? It's platonic, but it's beyond friendship. It's not sexual. It's not romantic. It's just a deep brotherly, connection. But then they have things like eros, and the Greek term for where we get our word erotic from. And eros is a sexual passion that in the Greek language is almost reckless. In fact, it has kind of a violent connotation to it, right? So the Greeks believed that eros was obviously a beneficial experience, but it was also something that was not logical, right? So they would separate the attraction, the sexual passion, from, right, the relationship itself. So if we look at those language ways to describe this, now we get this better picture of what is passionate love. Passionate love is attraction. It's vasopressin. It may be even, it's either physical stimulation or even sexual arousal, right? So passionate love is a connotation of a romantic relationship between two people. Companionate love doesn't have to be, right? Companionate love is going to be this level of intimacy. So that's the synonyms I'm going to use. If companionate love is intimacy, passionate love is attraction. So when you look at a functional relationship, right, we're going to get into this in just a second. When you look at a functional relationship, you need both of those things present. You need passion, right? It's called attraction. And you need intimacy. Call it companionship, right? So this was like 3 or 4 years ago. I had a student who, they asked me a question in class. They were like, so, of course, we're hypothetically asking for a friend. They were like, Coach, what if like somebody is in a friends with benefits relationship where they're like physically hooking up, but they don't want to like enter into a romantic relationship because it's like your closest friend in the world and you don't want to ruin the friendship by labeling it as a romantic relationship. I'm like, hold on. Let me get this straight. You have a physical and intimate relationship that both people are enjoying, and you don't want to ruin this relationship by giving it a title. Okay, just so we're all on the same page about that. And he's like, what would you call that? And I said, a marriage. I would call that a marriage, right? You're in a relationship, bro. I'm sorry. That's what a relationship looks like. So it's kind of this American or even Western idea that we don't really know what to do with romantic titles, as somehow, you know, you get people that are like anti-marriage or anti-monogamy because they believe, oh, well, if marriage is they just fail. So we can't get married because our relationship has a 50% chance of failing. Well, that doesn't change because you don't get married, right? I mean, our obsession with titles and labels is really kind of comical. So the idea here is that that's what you want, right? You want a passionate, attractive, physical relationship that's fulfilling with a person to whom that you have a deep emotional connection to. That's the goal, right? What's the problem here, in other words, right? So what is the issue? You're trying to figure out where we go from here. You're in a relationship, right? That's what it looks like. So, but the key is, well, now what do we do with this information? So then you get into things like, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, you get into the things about creating healthy boundaries, right? So what is it that you're willing to do in the context of relationship? Well, let's spin back to Erikson for a second, okay? So Erikson says during the teenage stage, you're trying to find your identity. So if you're trying to find your identity, that's a somewhat self-serving thing, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that's your developmental task. Your developmental task is to sort of try things on and figure out what works best for you. What college is going to benefit me the most? What relationship is going to fulfill me the most? What job do I want to do? Who am I as a person? What is my role? What am I good at? All these things are egocentric. I'm not going to go as far as to say narcissistic necessarily, because, you know, we use that word a lot, but egocentric is an important developmental stage in your life. So the problem with that is that we are in a stage as teenagers or adolescents going into your 20s where you're trying to figure yourself out, and then you have to figure out where another person fits into this. So here's where it can become problematic, right? A lot of people take offense to the statement that I made, right? That when you start to get into mature, adult, committed relationships, you have to be willing to create boundaries, right? And some people think, well, that's controlling, that's unfair. No, it is. No, it isn't, right? Because here's why. Let's say, for instance, that you begin a committed romantic relationship, right? And it starts to build intimacy, and you become, you know, monogamous, and both of you are, you know, kind of pouring into this relationship. The relationship's important to you. You're planning kind of your life together. You don't know what's going to happen, obviously, but you're committed to the relationship. Well, because of what we know about our interactions with other people, i.e. the mere exposure effect, you have an emotional responsibility to create healthy boundaries for the benefit of that relationship. You say, well, what does that look like? Okay, so I'm not saying that you can't have any acquaintance level with opposite sex people all of a sudden, but you have to be very cognizant of boundaries, right? So for instance, let's say heterosexual male and female, they enter into a dating relationship, right? And the guy, right, has a friend who's a female, and they've been friends since like 7th grade, and they go way back, right? So, I mean, would it be controlling of his new girlfriend, bless you, to say, you can't see her anymore? Yeah, that would be controlling. That's unreasonable. That shows a lack of trust. But, follow this, right? So let's say that it's not that he's friends with her. It's what is it that he is gaining from an intimacy standpoint from that friend. In other words, let me say it this way. What is he relying on her for? Does he get an emotional support from her? Because if so, that's a problem. You say, well, no, it's not. Yes, it is. Because you have a committed companion now. Your emotional support comes from that committed companion. Well, what, I'm supposed to just reject my friends from years and years? Not reject, that's a strong word. But yes, you're supposed to create healthy boundaries. So somebody asks, there's always these one-off scenarios, right? So what happens if the girl calls the guy and it's 2 o'clock in the morning and she's having an existential crisis and she needs to talk to him? And as a girlfriend, you're secure. Okay, let's pull on that thread then. Let's say that in an appropriate way, he has an appropriate conversation with her, i.e., on the phone, not in her car at Portofino at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the phone. And so it's a one-off scenario where he's helping her emotionally as a friend, one friend to another. And that's a scenario. If that becomes a habit, we got an issue, right? Because what happens if now all of a sudden you're dating 2 people? You have a romantic partner, but you're also depending on a separate third party for intimate fulfillment. That's an issue. It's a red flag. So sometimes as members of a romantic partner, you enter into a relationship and your significant other has a close personal friendship that you're not comfortable with. And so all of a sudden you're like, ooh, I don't want to be that controlling girlfriend or boyfriend, so maybe I just won't say anything. Well, no, you have the right to expect healthy boundaries in your relationship. So this whole idea of, well, he's supposed to just trust me, false. Do you care more about a non-romantic friendship than you do your romantic relationship? And you say, well, that's not fair. No, it isn't, because you get out of that relationship what you're willing to put into it. So if you're not willing to commit enough to create healthy boundaries, that relationship is not destined to do well. So again, what I'm not saying is as important as what I'm saying. It doesn't mean you have to cut off all of your friends and cut them off immediately. What it means is you have to create boundaries for that friendship that don't border on the inappropriate. And you're supposed to say, well, I'm not attracted to her. I don't see her that way. It's not a big deal. She's supposed to trust me. No, false. Mere exposure effect. You spend enough interpersonal time and you build intimacy through life experience with somebody else, intimacy can turn into attraction. We know that for a fact, right? So those are the things that now moving into your Erikson adulthood stage, as you guys are on the precipice of adult intimate relationships, you have to be cognizant of that. You have to care enough about your romantic partner to want to create those boundaries for 2 reasons. Out of respect for the other person, but also out of a respect for your own psychology. You say, well, I just know I can trust them. That doesn't, can you though? And does it matter? Right? I mean, so an emotional affair is really no different than a physical affair. Right? So that's the thing. It's not so much that, well, aren't I supposed to have friends? Well, yeah, but my question would be, what would be the purpose of a friendship? That's a platonic fulfillment of something that you don't need from your significant other. So if you're getting something from a friend that you're supposed to be getting from your significant other, then we have a problem. So again, it's not about alienating all of your friends. It's about creating healthy boundaries for those friendships so that you don't put yourself in a position that can slide into something that's more than a friendship.
There's different kinds of love that and I feel like I have a friend, one of a friend, female, who I've been friends with for years. I've had like 2 a.m., all that jazz, no attraction at all. Absolutely none.
I'm sorry. Yeah, what's the question there, though?
No, so my point is, you're saying it can't happen?
Correct, you're wrong. Yeah, you're wrong, and I'm right. Correct.
So,
no, it will, it can. And here's the thing, maybe it won't.
You're saying it hasn't happened yet?
No, and maybe it won't. And maybe it won't. To be fair to you, maybe it never will. But it's not, so here's, I'm glad that you asked that, because here's how I'm going to tie it into Erikson. Erikson would say, again, I'm going to use the word egocentric, not narcissism, because I think narcissism is a flawed level of egocentrism. You're at a stage of your life, let's use the word entitlement. I know that word gets used a lot. I'm going to tell you what I mean. When I was a teenager, as an athlete, as a boyfriend, as a student, as a son to my parents, I was very entitled out of ignorance. It was just my maturity state. Here's what I mean by entitled. I mean very literally, I didn't understand the concept of superordinate goals. That's one of your vocab words, right? So if I'm a part of an organization, let's say I play on a baseball team or something, and my baseball coach asks me, okay, I want you to show up at this time at this place, and we're going to sit down and we're going to eat a pregame meal or something, whatever, something silly. And then me as an athlete, being the infinitely wise 17-year-old I was, I'm going to ask the question, well, why? It doesn't matter why, right? Because why? Because now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be curious, but the tie-in here is to the Erikson development stage of I was in a very entitled, egocentric time in my developmental life. So everything was filtered through a self-serving bias. See where I'm going with that? Same thing with my relationships. If I'm dating this girl, what is it that I gain from this? If you were to ask my 17-year-old self, well, why do you like that girl? Well, because she makes me a better person. I like who I'm with when I'm around her. She's attractive to me. All those things are self-serving, right? So we have to take that same approach to boundaries. Why is it important that I don't downplay the possibility that I could build feelings for someone? Because it seems unreasonable as a teenager for you to ask me to walk away from a long-standing friendship. But it doesn't matter because you're not thinking about the superordinate goal of the relationship. Because I'm just going to speak for myself. I don't know how you guys are, but when I was a teenager, if somebody would have said, oh, I don't like that you hang around with her, it makes me uncomfortable, I would have gotten defensive. I would have said, well, why don't you trust me? But that's self-centered. I want to keep this relationship for me. It's not, is this relationship more important than my significant other? Should I care enough about my significant other to want to create healthy boundaries? Again, I'm not saying just cut them off and insult them and never talk to them again. But the point is this, that viewpoint, right, and I mean this very respectfully, that viewpoint is a self-serving bias. It is an egocentric point of view. Why does that benefit me, though, coach? And that's how you are as athletes. Your coach tells you to wear red socks, and you're like, I don't want to wear red socks. That's stupid. No one cares what you think in that organization. Who's in charge of that organization? It doesn't matter if your coach asks you to wear red socks, because that's a part of the cultural expectation, and you don't get to decide. Now, if your coach or stakeholder or teacher or whatever decides to ask you to do something that violates your morals or ethics and they ruin sports for you or whatever, you have the freedom to walk away from that, right? That's the mature decision. But the point I'm making is this. Everything we filter through, right, and these dumb millennials in my age bracket just like to use that word entitled, like, oh, these young kids are so entitled. So were we. Everyone's entitled as teenagers. Even Erikson pointed that out half a century ago. That's the point of being an adolescent. You have to start entitled to figure yourself out. Only when you're emotionally and cognitively ready to enter into a sacrificing relationship are you ready to be a good significant other. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't date right now? Well, no, not necessarily. But you have to understand that your relationship dynamics at this point in your life may not look like the functional relationship dynamics of a long-standing relationship. And the numbers don't lie, right? The divorce rate is 50%. So what changed? Did our biology change? Are we less monogamous now as people? No. Our culture changed. Our sense of entitlement changed. Why do people get divorced? They get divorced because they're not happy. It's a self-serving entitlement, right? That's the issue here, is that when we have issues, it's because we're thinking about ourselves and how this affects us, not how does this affect the other person. So if we stop and think, well, maybe she's uncomfortable with this. Maybe I don't even want to put her in a scenario where she would have to evaluate the nature of this relationship. Maybe I like this person, there's a place for them in my life, but I need to change the dynamics of this relationship so that my significant other doesn't have to wonder about me. That's the difference. That's superordinate, above the needs of myself, so that I can serve the needs of the organization, right? Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I worded my point the right way.
Right.
I was trying to say if there's different kinds of love and you get certain, you're not, I don't think you can be expected to gain every kind of love that you one individual relationship.
You absolutely can.
So how can I get brotherly love from?
Well, okay, that's a fair point. So that's a different dynamic. You're right. In that regard, you're right. So if we're saying the Greek version of brotherly love, you're right. That's a different dynamic. That's not like a romantic type of attraction. Right. I see.
Right. So, like for example, I think the thing I get out of this relationship I'm talking about is like a sisterly love. But there's no.
Yeah, but why do you need that? Why do you need a sisterly love?
Simply because I enjoy it.
Exactly.
I just don't need it.
Yeah.
To my point, I don't understand why you can't have that and then a relationship.
Well, it's not that you can't. It might work. Again, there's never say never. But my point is, what would you gain from that friendship that you wouldn't gain from being in a healthy romantic relationship? You know what I mean? Like, in other words, what is missing from that sisterly love? Like, what component is missing from that female bonded relationship that you're not getting from your significant other?
So you say not necessarily like, it's not that the components of sisterly.
Right. Right. So you would gain your brotherly companionship from people, right? Maybe they're male, or maybe they're female, maybe they're whatever. So there is a place for that in your life. You need those people. You need healthy friends. You need people that you can talk to, people that will support you, people that will even mentor you, right? But my question is, and I know it's going to sound crazy, but just hear me out for a second. Why do those people need to be women?
Well, I think in essence, sisterly love kind of implies female.
Yeah, but why do you need sisterly love as opposed to brotherly love?
Well,
Like, what female companionship are you not gaining from a romantic relationship?
I'm not gaining anything from this personal relationship with a female that I couldn't. I was using sisterly love as
Right.
an example.
Right.
It pretty much is the same as
Right.
brotherly love. Like,
Now, again, it sounds really unfair and harsh. I'm not saying that you can't have functional female relationships. I'm just saying it becomes problematic when people are, let's say, substituting a female platonic friend with a role that they should be gaining from their romantic, because that's what accidentally happens, right? So you're like, it's even worse. It sounds weird to say this, but it's even worse when you're like, oh, I have no romantic attraction to this woman whatsoever. Well, that's worse, because now all of a sudden you're oblivious to the fact that you're building intimacy with them, right? So I'm going to go talk to them. It's completely friend situation. I'm just going to ask her advice, right? Well, what happens? Now all of a sudden you're fighting with your significant other, and then you go and you hang out with this other female, and you're talking to her about your relationship problems, and she identifies with you, and she can be there for you. Well, it's not long before you realize, well, she gets me. Maybe she gets me more than my significant other does. So the difference is, and I know it's going to sound gender biased, but the difference is, if you have male friends, there's no potential issue for sexual or romantic politics there. The mere exposure effect can't happen with your platonic male friends, is my point. You're not going to accidentally slip into an emotional affair with your male friend. So there's a place for that companionship, you're correct. But I'm arguing that you have to create a different level of, you can have those friendships with females, but it's got to look different, right? It's got to look different. You have to create, so let's say that you do have those conversations with her, but they're on the phone and not in person. But even if they are, you find yourself talking to her for 2 hours every single night, right? I mean, even if it's innocent and harmless, you're telling me that your significant other is going to not, she's just going to be cool with that, right? At what point is she going to see, oh, maybe there's an issue here?
you want like an answer?
No. I mean, yeah, just hypothetically speaking, yeah. Let's hypothetically say you were in a romantic relationship and in this platonic friendship that you're talking about. At some point, do you foresee the girlfriend having problems with this relationship?
I could probably foresee that.
Even if you don't have issues. So you see the issue? It's not that you're not capable of doing it, right? And that's fair. It's not that you're not capable of not straying. It's that now you've created this dynamic where your significant other becomes suspicious of a relationship. And you say, well, that's not fair. Yeah, it is. Your significant other has the right to expect boundaries, right? That's just the reality of the situation.
You're saying that I couldn't get the emotional, I don't know.
Not that you couldn't. I'm saying what is it that you would need to get?
No, yeah, but you're saying something along the lines of, I don't remember exactly, but the emotional gains from a female friend is different from a male friend. I think that's
No, it's not that the emotional gains are different. It's that there's the added dynamic of attraction. The attraction is not a potential issue. So the term mere exposure effect means when you build intimacy and bond with people, it can sometimes develop into attraction. And with someone that you're not sexually attracted to, like, say, a male, biologically speaking, there's not the issue of the mere exposure effect. That dynamic is not ever going to slip into a sexual attraction, so you're not going to have to worry about the relationship becoming inappropriate. right? It's not, to your point, it's not that you have a different emotional bond with females that you do with males. It's that there's the added possibility of attraction with someone of the opposite sex, or if you're you know, not heterosexual, that someone of the same sex.
So I just want to make sure I get what you're saying. So theoretically, it would be no issues if you and the other person both never ended up having an attraction to each other, and the significant others of one or both people were
If you could be assured that they were okay with it and they weren't just telling you that, yeah. It's possible. Again, it's possible. I'll sum it up by saying this. There's a whole added dynamic to it that you don't have to navigate with same-sex friends, right, if that makes sense. What were you going to say? Oh, okay. Clarify that. All right. So, again, I like using the Erikson example because I think that sometimes, I don't think, like I said this in the toxic relationship video, I don't think there's toxic people. I think there's toxic traits. Let's get into attribution theory, because traits are important, because sometimes traits are implicit and we don't realize it, right? There's things that we learn and things that we do that's like latent, dormant learning that we don't even realize that we do, right? So let's talk about attribution. I know it seems like a weird segue, but it's actually a good one, because your traits aren't necessarily intentional. So let's say that you didn't mean for this relationship to progress past what's appropriate. It doesn't matter what your intentions were, right? So your traits could, they could potentially, they say a lot about your developmental needs, right, at a certain stage. So from an Erikson standpoint, your personality traits or your social task as a teenager is self-serving, right? So when you get into a romantic relationship, when I got into a romantic relationship as a teenager, most of my thought processes were filtered through my own personal bias. I'm just being honest with you. Is that bad? It's not great, but it's natural, right? So as I got older and I had more interactions with people and I gained empathy and I saw the progression of relationships and I realized maybe there's a lot more selflessness that I need to pour into the situation here. Like, what's my responsibility to this person, to the relationship? Well, that's growth. That's maturity, right? So traits are one thing. So let me teach you this term. It's called attribution theory, right? So let's think about the word attribute. The word attribute means to assign responsibility, to associate with, to connect to. Let's call it assigning responsibility or assigning blame. Blame sounds like it's bad, right? So let me give you an example from like a test type question. We have this scenario of dispositional attribution versus situational attribution, right? So if you're writing things down, right, attribution theory, underneath it make two subcategories, dispositional, situational. Because you're going to see these on your test, but here's the example, right? If we were to say, you could take any topic, right? First period brought up, like teach your sons to be better, like implying toxic masculinity, right? And so that would be blaming the disposition or the traits of a person, right? So if inappropriate male behavior was the result of a person's disposition, it's their responsibility. The responsibility falls on them. Dispositional attribution says this is on you. Situational attribution says this is on the situation, right? So here's what that looks like as a question. If you get a test question that's like, Sally's the valedictorian of her graduating class. She worked really hard and studied for 4 years of high school and achieved this high honor. Well, that's a dispositional attribution. To what are we attributing her achievement? To her traits, right? It's Sally that did that. What if we talk about something like prejudice or systemic racism, toxic masculinity, right? That's a situational attribution. The cycle of poverty, right? Toxic whiteness, right? That's situational. Now, I'm not saying one is right and the other is wrong. What I'm saying is in any given situation, we do one or the other. And what we run into is this other vocab term that's referred to as a fundamental attribution error. Right? So again, don't get hung up in the jargon of the specific definition. Just think about what the words mean. That means when we create an error in judgment in assigning blame, specifically, we assign too much blame to the person's traits and not enough blame to the situation. Right? So you've heard me say this many times. Things that happen to you may not necessarily be your fault, but they are your responsibility. So let's say that you grew up in a household where the situation was toxic, and maybe you had racially prejudicial parents, right? Maybe you had racially prejudicial grandparents. And maybe you were nurtured in a situation to be prejudiced. So can we attribute that to you as a person, as your personal fault? Maybe not. But you're the result of the situation that you came from. It doesn't mean it's not your responsibility, though, right? So then we get into locus of control. So let's say you come from a cycle of poverty, right? If we're blaming your lack of, here's a good example, right? This person is poor because they can't hold down a job and they're an addict. We're blaming their disposition for their economic situation. What if we blame the situation they come from? This person is impoverished because they come from a dysfunctional background, right? That's a situational attribution. So it sounds really academic and wordy, but you just have to be able to differentiate to what are we attributing, to what are we attributing the explanation. Are we attributing this to the person's traits? Are we attributing it to the situation from which they came? So the fundamental attribution error is when we overestimate personal traits and underestimate situational environmental factors. Like, so for instance, you look at something like poverty is a good example. We'll just stick with that one. If we blame all impoverished people personally, right, and we say, well, those people, they have bad traits, those people are lazy, they don't have a work ethic, that's a fundamental attribution error because we're discounting the situation that made them that way, right? So a couple of interesting studies when we talk about correlations not being causations, right? You look at we talked about intelligence. Intelligence is a lot more nurtured than you realize. It was a prevailing thought through most of the first half of the 20th century that intelligence was completely biological, right? It's heritability. You have two smart parents, they breed and make a smart baby. Kind of. Kind of. In fact, when you look at the statistics, it points to more of a situation than a disposition because when you look at, and it spans gender and it spans race, impoverished kids in America have statistically lower IQs. I'm not talking about school achievement now. They are less intelligent statistically than affluent children. There are outliers, of course. But there are massive longitudinal studies that are showing this. It is a statistical, I don't want to say fact, but it is a statistical truth that kids that come from impoverished situations have lower levels of quantifiable intelligence. But if we misinterpret the cause for that, from that correlation, we could say, okay, well, their parents are unintelligent, that's why they're poor, but that's also why they made an unintelligent child. And it's not really that, because biology doesn't explain it, because there's no other biological categories that align with it. It's completely social. It points to nurture. So what neurologists are finding out is how much nurture goes into intellectual development. So the reality is this: you didn't hit the genetic lottery, you hit the socioeconomic lottery. Your parents fostered a level of intelligence in you by the age of 4. That's the number, believe it or not. 4. If you don't, that's your critical period where billions of synapses are connecting all the time. If you don't gain a certain level of linguistics, a certain level of reading, a certain level of basic like mathematical computation, a certain level of emotional intelligence, if that doesn't get fostered by 4, you're done. And it doesn't mean that you can't make gains and you can't catch up somewhat to your peers, but your emotional development happens before, your intellectual development happens before the age of 4, mostly. That's kind of shocking. It's kind of horrifying. So what do we look at that? That we can look situationally at how are the situations of impoverished people different than the situations of affluent people, right? It's not so much that they lack resources. It is part of it, sure, but it's that what is it that affluent parents are doing that impoverished parents are not doing? Or even conversely, what is it that impoverished parents are doing that affluent parents are not doing? Right? So somebody today asked me, well, like, how do I foster intelligence in my child someday? How do I not screw them up? And I said that you will. They're like, how do I know? Because you've been implicitly trained that way. You're going to raise your kids the same way your parents raised you. And they're going to be more intelligent than their average peer. It's nurture. And that kind of sucks because there's not a whole lot the school system can do about that. There's not a whole lot that you can do. And it's just like social development also, right? So the best thing that you can do to prevent a child from going down a problematic path behaviorally is put them in a functional environment before the age of 12. If you try to rehabilitate a child after the age of 12, it's almost impossible. In fact, the statistics are so stacked against you that it's an outlier, right? So programs like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, I mean, those are good programs and they should happen, and maybe you can catch and save a few of them. But the reality is this. I mean, the streets are undefeated. Between 9 and 12, that's when you steer the direction socially of kids, right? And that's unfortunate as a coach and as a teacher, because you get a troubled child and you want to help them. Doesn't mean that you can't help them in some way, shape, or form. But you're not going to overrule more than a decade of conditioning, more than a decade of nurture, right? They have developed their social self by the age of 12. And the numbers are almost right at 12, right? Even if you move when you do nothing else but move a child from one neighborhood to another neighborhood before the age of 12 and stay there through graduation, the graduation rate goes up almost 50%. It's crazy. Environment has a lot more to do with who we are than we want to give ourselves credit as parents and people. Now, give your parents credit because they did the things to foster intelligence in you, but that's situational. Poverty is situational, right? But there's not a whole lot that we can do to infuse change in that situation, right? What kind of policy can the government pass to infuse a situational change? It doesn't mean we don't try. Maybe access to resources will change the nurture of those households. I don't know if that's true or not. But that's the thing. A fundamental attribution error. We put too much blame on personality factors, or let's call them dispositional traits, and not enough blame on the environment of the situation, right? A lot more things are nurtured than we want to admit, right? So let's talk about some other sociological vocab terms. This is a good one. This is known as the foot in the door phenomenon. And you're experts at this if you don't realize it. The foot in the door phenomenon is this social interaction when it's kind of like the slippery slope syndrome. It's where what starts as a small request will eventually progress into much larger requests, right? So you ask your dad for $5 so that you can get food before practice, right? Well, when he gives you $5, the precedent has been set, right? So the other scenario, eventually you're going to ask for more money, right? Eventually you're going to ask for money more often. And that's natural. It's not that you're trying to take advantage of someone, right? Foot in the door phenomenon is what that is. So we'll talk about conformity and obedience tomorrow.